Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. As you can see by my backdrop, I am on the road. I'm on the Pennsylvania Turnpike at the moment, on my way to New Jersey. But I had to stop in a rest stop, one of the many awesome rest stops on the Turnpike, just to do this show with James Valliant, of course, my favorite co-host. And we're going to be doing something. We're going to be doing a show today about I don't know that it's a controversial topic anymore. It's been the subject of news for the last few weeks. On January 7th, a young man, 29-year-old black man by the name of Tyre Nichols, was pulled over ostensibly for reckless driving by 5 Memphis police officers who proceeded to beat him to the point where 3 days after he died. This, of course, brings up tons of issues that have been on the forefront of, I think, the American psyche and the news cycle for a very long time with respect to police brutality, funding of police, training of police. And I think we're going to get into all the details with James. Nobody knows it. I think the law better than him, and the perspective of applying objectivism to the law better than him. James, welcome again. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Always great to see you, Mark. Yeah, what a horrific, grim thing. Usually I say, because of my 18 years experience as a public prosecutor in the United States, I usually say at this point in criminal investigations and cases, hey, let's not form any judgments. Let's not be rushed to judgment. Let's get all the evidence. And because too often I have seen the press, jump the gun, not know what they were talking about. Experts start flapping their jaws when they don't have all the facts. In this age, though, of police body cams and video cameras everywhere and cell phones taking pictures, people just out on the street, we really it's almost as though we can witness the event ourselves. And in this case, I've seen several now angles and various body cam shots, and I am able, as a witness to the extent of what I saw, come to a very negative evaluation about these police officers. And I use the term police officer generously. It was really horrific. They beat this man to death for no even slightly justifiable reason. As a prosecutor, I worked with cops, and I know that they can get emotional. They're human beings like all the rest of us. If they're chasing down, in hot pursuit of some violent criminal, or if there's someone they stopped and it become a physical threat to them, I can understand them getting emotional. They're humans like the rest of us. That does not justify them in using excessive force, but at least I can understand the emotion. In this case, the first thing that struck me, and it's absolutely remarkable, how fired up these cops were. They pull him out for a traffic stop? A traffic stop? And they're already upset. He gets away from their beating, and then they chase him down. Some other cops come in and intervene, and then they continue the beating and then beat him to death over there. I cannot for the life of me fathom what got these cops so hyped up emotionally on a case like this. You have a nonviolent guy. It's a relatively routine traffic stop. You have to wonder what caused this. I have my own thinking about what might have caused this, but just from looking at the video, it was unjustifiable violence. These guys are murderers. They are crooks in cop uniform. And I think there are various reasons why that's happening. But I think there's also a wider context to these issues, as you say, that we've gone through in recent years that might also be worth discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen curated versions of the video, so I haven't watched the entire video through. I think it's something like 26 minutes or more. It's quite lengthy. I've only seen edited sections of it from news clips. It certainly seems that from moment one, when they first stop him and approach his vehicle, they were highly aggressive, which to anybody in that situation, I imagine particularly a Black person who, has a great deal more baggage to bring to a confrontation of that type, that would be frightening. That would be a very frightening thing, which seems at various points in this encounter, as it began to escalate, he feared for his life and was trying to run for his life to get away from these people who were beating him, pepper spraying him, and shocking him to attempt to get him to comply exactly with their orders. So if he was on the ground and he said, I'm on the ground, they're like, on your stomach, give me your, they keep telling him to progressing the orders in a highly, highly aggressive way. Now you say you have some ideas about why this happens. Tell me about your thoughts and feelings about why approach a situation from the get-go like this? Why escalate aggression until it becomes deadly?
In recent years, police recruitment, police training, police hiring of new cops has become harder and harder. Just as with the military, it's harder to get people to want to be cops. And when you have fewer applicants, that reduces the population group from which you're selecting, and it means you're going to have to reduce your standards by necessity. And one of the most important things, perhaps the most important thing that officer hiring and training looks to is the psychological demeanor of the person with whom we're going to entrust the use of authorized force. We're going to give them a gun and a billy club, and we're going to go tell them to go arrest violent criminals or break up bar fights, at 2 a.m. So they have to have the right kind of psychological demeanor and training. Absolutely. And with declining numbers even wanting to be cops, they just have to reduce their standards. It also creates a psychological mentality among certain police officers of being on the outside, alienated, hated by their communities. And this gives them an us versus them mentality. We're the enemy, we're the perceived enemy going into any situation. And I think between the two, it's increasing, let me put it this way, decreasing the standards, the psychological standards, the educational standards, even creating problems within training because they're letting things slide by that maybe they shouldn't have to. I would note that the 5 cops all arrested here were short-termers that all only been on the force for 2 or 3 years, suggesting to me that they are in fact recent hires. That being the case, I can only think that, yeah, this is part of that problem. We also know that with both soldiers and cops, people who are trained to use force, the use of force can become an emotional thing for them. You notice that at the end of this video, one of the more disturbing things is the way the cops are fist bumping and high-fiving and, yeah, get this? We even have allegations now that cops were taking pictures at the scene of the crime and sharing them with other officers. That's being investigated now. So I think that they had a special unit that they just formed only in recent years called the Scorpion Unit. It was an acronym for something, stopping crime or violence or something. But this new unit that all of these cops were involved in has also been involved in other accusations that have come to light since this arrest. Other people have come forward saying, yeah, I was yanked out of my car because, I was just walking away. They wanted to talk to me. I was just a witness. This poor woman was yanked out of the car by one of the same officers recently in a very similar situation. I think there was another allegation of a person stopped for a traffic stop who was also mistreated and beaten, not to death. I mean, here the young man was beaten to death. And as you say, can you imagine being a young African-American male, especially the way we look at cops these days, the way the press has covered cops these days? I think it's important to set a broader context on that broader issue too. The fact is that of the millions of police contacts that occur every year, of the more than 1 million arrests that cops make every year in the United States, there are only about 1,000 or so police-involved shootings. Now think about that. That is a very small number. It also has been declining over the years. Declining. In fact, accusations of excessive force have been declining steeply over the decades. If you are, now let's imagine you're involved in one of those 1,000 officer-involved shootings. How many involved the shooting of an unarmed person? Well, that's only a couple of dozen. And in most of those cases, the cops are found to have acted justifiably, at least. Yeah, it looked like it was a deadly threat. And more than that, your odds, now get this, your odds of being shot as an unarmed person, if you're a black man, are greater to be shot by a black cop than by a white cop.
But we haven't, as you said, there's two factors immediately that make us think the situation with cops is looking bleak. One, the pool from which we get to select police is going down because the popularity of the job is going down. Cops are increasing. People are increasingly viewing cops as not a very positive or good influence on society, and so they have to choose from a worse and worse sort of group of folks. There's a culture also of us versus them where they feel very separated from them, and of course, an us versus them mentality is a conflict forward type of mentality. You also have the news highlighting every single, particularly racially charged incident that happens between cops and civilians. So especially a black person being pulled over by a cop is going to have the sensationalized news in his mind and in his psyche informing him. So we have a situation that seems uniquely qualified for brutality. One of the things I wanted to say, though, because I didn't hear this amongst the conditions, is more and more laws are being passed that give police officers greater latitude with respect to the kinds of force that they can use against people. Now, we're pushing back against that now, but lots of libertarian types, people who like liberty, like objectivists, even some folks on the right who are a little more free state libertarian oriented, oftentimes equate the way in which we're going as into a police state. Does that kind of scenario, that kind of socio-political situation, prime the pump, so to speak, for those types of aggressive authoritarian types to occupy the role as opposed to somebody who's actually a protector or a night watchman?
Exactly. Philosophically, from an objectivist standpoint, we've seen distressingly the rise of tribalism. We've seen the reigniting of racist tribalism, unfortunately, on both the right and the left, frankly. And then of course the cops, cops are, because of this anti-police attitude, themselves targeted, assassinated. Innocent young cops just sitting in their police unit, people will come up and assassinate them, shoot them because of this perception. And so long as it is increasingly looked at in this tribalistic way, of course, both sides are going to look, oh, I'm being targeted. No, I'm being targeted. Right. Now, of course, police force is an inherent problem. We do authorize people to have the morally legitimate use of force. And that always has to be regulated. That's why we need a Bill of Rights. That's why we need to hamstring government. So we need to have civil rights lawsuits against these cops who do have, as you say, increasingly, the people have wanted to eliminate for example, the immunity that officers have from lawsuits. You have to sue the agency, not the cop himself personally, if you had a beef, except under certain circumstances. And I think that needs to be looked into. Absolutely. But this is an area where inherently we need to have strict rules, strict regulations governing when and how officers can do their job. If it is objectively apparent to an officer, even if he's wrong. Let's say a cop sees someone crawling out of a window, a second-story window at 2 a.m. of some business that's closed. It's perfectly reasonable for the cop to approach that person and see if it's a burglar, right? I mean, they're paid to be suspicious. On the other hand, we have to have strict rules about how they use force and how they investigate cases. I'm a big fan of these body cams. I see no reason why every officer in the field should not be equipped with one of these body cams. If anything, that I think will help reduce the number of cases. And again, it only increases in my mind the wonder. All of these cops knew that there were body cams and cell phones going on around here, and yet they did what they did.
Well, sometimes, I know people who've been on reality shows and there's cameras in their faces all the time. And after a couple of weeks, they just sort of forget that they're there. So,
right.
It's highly possible that this just becomes a part of their life and they forget that they're there. I have to say, if any one of these cops or any 3 of these cops had a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, none would have happened. They could have gently made him comply if he wasn't complying exactly the way they thought he should comply, with no screaming, no aggression, and no hurt. They wouldn't have pulled guns, which it looked like they did fairly immediately. They wouldn't have to taser. They wouldn't have to pepper spray him. They just gently put him on the ground exactly where they want him to be, and he would not really be able to do anything about it.
It was a traffic stop. They had his car, they knew the registration. Even if the young man had ran away and they hadn't caught up to him then and there, it is highly likely they would have been able to contact him at some later point. Why is it that you see my point? Why is it that a traffic stop of all things, when he's leaving the car that he was driving behind, you'll be able to catch up with him probably. Why does that cause in you this fury that you have to go chase him down and literally beat this young man to death? It's outrageous. It really is. And it's got to reflect something bad in our culture. The question is race too. And a lot of people have said, and I know we were talking about this last week when we were discussing this a little bit, the 5 cops that were initially charged were all African Americans themselves, as well as the young man. Now, on the left, we're hearing, well, it's still racism. White supremacy can still be involved in a case like this because it's affecting the minds of African Americans. White supremacy, I think, is taking it a little far. I don't know that African Americans are tremendously influenced by current white supremacy. On the other hand, racism can have and does have a negative impact on African Americans. It's not just, whites that are the problem with racism. It's African Americans inculcating in themselves a negative view of themselves. People forget the self-esteem effect that racism has. It's not just an aggressive thing that other people can do unfairly, judging people by their race, but it's something we can do to ourselves. And that never really gets a lot of play. So if racism here is a factor, it's a different kind of factor than it would be than, say, white, I would define as white supremacy, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Before we get to some possible solutions for this craziness, do we have any super chats that?
That's a fair question. And I had my glasses here just a second ago, and I seem to have misplaced them. So I'm unfortunately in the position of asking Daniel to read. I do see we have some questions in the chat. I wonder, Daniel, if you could help me out here.
Yes, sir. Can you, for us? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much for $1. We have a super chat from Catherine for $5. She says, "It was horrible. Agree with James. Lower standards, less training."
No, that's exactly it. It's exactly it. We're hiring now. We're forced to hire cops because of lower standards. And I think there are a lot of good reasons why cops don't want to be cops today. I mean, so many of the big cities in the United States are having an increasing crime problem, especially with violent crimes and things like that. And minor crimes, it's because liberal, what we call leftist DAs, leftist mayors of these cities are simply not prosecuting criminals the way they used to. If people get right out of jail, if it's a revolving door, and that's what's happening with these new bail rules that they have, dangerous criminals with records are being let right out of jail after a felony arrest to commit more crimes. If you're a cop and you're making an arrest and you've just arrested someone on a felony and you see him out on the street the next day, that's got to destroy your motivation. It really, really does. Fewer people are thinking that being a policeman, which is already a thankless task, there you are, a cop. I remember I was a DA for 18 years, and the stories that I would hear are just horrific. They would have to clean up traffic accidents, or they'd have to go to a domestic violence scene where a couple are bloody and fighting each other and drunk at 2 a.m, and they've got to separate them. It is a dangerous, unpleasant task out there, and it's often a thankless task. They get sworn at and spit at for doing their job, and now to in effect unfairly demonize them, which to some degree was happening, has now actually reduced the actual standards in hiring because fewer people want to be cops. I think that's a part of it.
Indeed. So there was a big movement after George Floyd to defund the police. Now, intuitively, that just struck me as wrong, because it seemed to me what the problem was lack of training, which meant that you needed more funding so that these people could not only resolve conflicts effectively, but be trained physically to deal with potential conflict in a non-lethal way. Now, to me, that means this: if you're a beat cop, if you're out there and you're potentially subjecting yourself to violent encounters with people, you, one, have to be in condition, and two, you have to be at least a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which would enable you to handle pretty much any one-on-one issue with somebody without having to take your gun out, take your taser out, pepper spray them. You can easily handle people who are much bigger and stronger than you with these techniques. And if there's a couple of you on the scene who have this capacity, you're even more capable of handling somebody like that without really hurting them at all. So definitely more funding, definitely training and physical conditioning for the people who are going to be out there. Body cams for everybody, and perhaps there's something to be said for civilian oversight. I think people feel a little uncomfortable that perhaps police commissions are inside, internal affairs bureaus are in other words, police investigating police makes people feel uncomfortable. Maybe they would want somebody who's not so quote unquote interested and would have a little bit more philosophical and emotional detachment from the idea to oversee some of these incidents. So what say you to all this stuff?
Oh, I definitely agree with each and every one of those elements. And when an officer is involved in any kind of incident, generally there is a review board involved that involves both current but also retired officers, but people who are not peace officers. I think that's an important thing. If there is an investigation, what we'll do is we will convene a grand jury. And those are people, ordinary people from the street. And that gives me my own experience with that grand jury experience. They meet in secret, but they're ordinary people from the community. And they can give hey, something stinks there, or something. Oh, no, there's some, I don't care. That looked like he was justified. That outsider view gives a much better view on reviewing whether it was excessive police force or not. But yeah, we have to absolutely be on guard against this sort of thing. And I have to also confirm what you were saying about martial arts. Those police officers whom I knew to be trained in martial arts, it was astonishing. It was astonishing. They could, with one hand or one move, de-escalate an entire situation. In effect, take the guy who's initiating the violence out without injuring him at all. Just quiet him down, silence him, put him off the scene for a few seconds so they can calm the situation down and get a control over it. So I really also want to endorse that idea. If the better their training in self-defense, martial arts, how to subdue without using deadly force, and those are the officers that can very quickly subdue without using deadly force and at least get a handle on a situation initially. I think all that's very helpful as well. I think
reverse that officers who rarely pull guns and or fire them at people spend lots of time on the firing range learning how to fire that weapon, which is important. But they spend almost no time engaging in the hand-to-hand kind of things that they're going to find themselves in 100% of the time, nearly every day. And they don't know how to grapple. So if they have to qualify in the pistol range, which I think they should also qualify on the mat. All right. You practice de-escalating situations with people whom you don't know what they're going to do. And you practice that jiu-jitsu that you need to be proficient out there. And once you qualify, you can go out into the streets. If you don't qualify, you're on a desk job. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. And there are ways of dealing with this. I mean, if an officer even has a slight problem, even if there's a controversy, working with people like the San Diego Police Department or the FBI, you realize that's what they do. Even if there's a suspicion, they'll take them off the streets. They'll get them, they'll investigate the case. They'll get them into counseling, even before they know what's going on. Give them a desk job, for gosh sake. And if they are involved in something that looks bad, you put them on administrative leave. There are ways of dealing with this, but one of the worst things to do is to set the officer against the community. Communities have tried very, very hard to have officers reflect the community ethnically. And more than that, cops who come from that neighborhood know what's going on, know the schools, know the gangs, know the families, know the businesses. The more you can have community, and this was something that was coming in as I was a DA, community policing, getting beat cops back to understand their neighborhoods, understand their people. I think that goes a long way in eliminating these incidents. But of course, when you're hostile to the cops, when cops are evil as such, when everybody has this exaggerated, unrealistic view of police violence, especially as it relates to race, I think that it is overstated. I think it's ridiculously overstated. But now we're getting into a position where it's becoming more and more of a reality because they're having to scrape the bottom of the barrel to get these cops. It's really a phenomenon of the neo-tribalism we're experiencing in this century.
Indeed, and the tribes are sort of divided as well into the causes of crime. And right now, the people in control believe that forces exterior to you are responsible for that. It's society, and that's why they're turning these people around and diminishing the punishments for the things that they do, rather than holding them accountable. It's society, it's us. We have to and redefine things so that we're not stigmatizing these folks as criminals. So we'll raise the lower the penalty for larceny, say, to, you know, anything over $950 now we'll consider theft in California, and it incentivizes a epidemic of shoplifting and theft to the point where major stores in major chains you'd think would be able to absorb costs are leaving cities.
Right.
Or, look, when I came to
they're leaving by the every week there's a new truck pulling out a big business from Chicago, and can you blame them?
When I came to Pittsburgh, I was shocked to see allergy medication not locked behind cabinets, because in California people are walking out with that stuff and closing down stores because of it, and so they're all behind locked cabinets. Pretty much anything that's over $20 is locked behind the cabinet. Awful.
Well, I think that we have to make a distinction that the left does not make. There are certain crimes which do disproportionately affect minorities, especially African Americans and people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. I would point out drug crimes. If you are, let's put it this way, if you've got a drug problem and you come from a wealthy upper middle class neighborhood, the cops are very unlikely to even find you doing drugs in your pleasant home. If you are, however, having to do it on the streets or buy it on the streets, and you are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the cops are going to be able to get you easier. And so the drug laws, for example, have a disproportionate effect on Blacks. There's no question about it. And I oppose drug laws as such. They're nonviolent crimes, and the police are using force and violence to get at it. So the war on drugs has been a bloody mess. It has created racial disparities effective racial disparities in how law is enforced. Now, our leftist friends are letting thieves and violent criminals out because the cops are bad. And if you have that kind of an attitude about crime, rather than looking at ways we can perhaps increase the effectiveness of crimes, of what the cops are doing, and reduce the incidence of violence by cops in nonviolent situations, then let me suggest we get rid of these crimes that don't really violate someone else's rights, drug laws, and a whole host of other laws, which are inherently situations in which cops are bringing more force than is morally necessary to the situation. And it's having a disproportionate effect on minorities. But to let violent criminals out, to let thieves out, to ignore theft, as you point out, now what you're going to create is this entire resentment from the community, from police, and so forth. And there'll be this slopping, this package deal that both sides are engaged in. Yep, that guy over there with the minor drug possession, cops, you pull out your guns and use force over there. So we'll say the conservative. And then the liberal will say, oh, no. What we have to do is we have to let the guy who's been just charged with armed robbery out, because after all, the bail laws are unfair. No, that's a totally different situation altogether. First of all, I didn't think that there was an inherent unfairness, equity issue with bail as such, even though rich people can more afford bail. What it is it's securing the person's appearance in court. In certain murder cases or aggravated sex crimes, the judge can deny bail altogether, whatever your income. If it's a lesser crime, if you're in jail, you're getting credit for time served. If the rich person gets convicted, he's going to have to go serve the whole time in there. At the end of the day, it didn't come out in an unbalanced way. This was totally wrong. Holding felons, holding violent criminals in on bail protects the community. The police have to have probable cause to make that arrest. So I think we're getting very distorted views from each side, not understanding and making the important distinctions. If the criminal is not really violating anyone else's rights, the cop is the initiator of the violence. As such. But we can't use that as an excuse to let violent criminals go, which seems to be what's going on.
Indeed, I've of course want the drug laws to be rescinded as well, but I've also read, I could be mistaking this, that some of the disparities, for example, between cocaine and crack, which they like to highlight, fall disproportionately against blacks. Some of those sentencing disparities were encouraged by Black communities, because their neighborhoods were being rotted out by drugs and associated violence. And they wanted these penalties to be hard because they wanted these drug dealers and these violent offenders out of their communities. And so the Congressional Black Caucus apparently passed on all of this stuff, and Obama limited them a little bit under, protests from the, of course, life-hating left. And he limited them somewhat, but still kept the penalties quite heavy. And that was in the interest of protecting the Black community against all the rampant crime in their areas.
Yes, sir. I lived through that very phenomenon in the 1990s. I really did. I lived through that. Senator Joe Biden, by the way, was a huge advocate of these minimum mandatory sentences, even for nonviolent drug crimes, by the way. But in California, for example, if you were caught with a whole bunch of methamphetamine, we could give you a misdemeanor. We could give you a lower sentence. You didn't have to go to prison, even if you got convicted on a felony. If, however, it was cocaine, especially crack cocaine, prison mandatory, unreducible felony. What? How does that possibly make any sense?
It's just arbitrary.
It's arbitrary and it's unjust. And you are absolutely right. At the time, there were leftist Democrats, people from the minority community who said, yes, we have to zero in on crack. Now, I think there was an exaggeration about crack babies, and that was well exposed at the time. But at the time, when we increased sentences on violent criminals and repeat offenders, that had a good salutary effect in reducing crime. Throughout the 90s and the early 21st century, it was reducing crime significantly. The bad part of it was that they had mandatory minimums on nonviolent, simple drug possession type cases. And we had to wait for Donald Trump, of all people, to start getting reform against these mandatory minimum sentences that were, again, disproportionately affecting Blacks. We had this insane world in which we were treating nonviolent drug criminals really horrifically, as if they were violent criminals. And that had a very unfair negative impact. But again, a package deal, we want to get rid of all mandatory minimum sentences, whether it's a violent criminal or a drug criminal. And again, that makes no sense to me. Daniel, do we have more activity going on in the chat?
Yeah, we have a super chat from Robert. Thank you for $5. He says, are cops out of control? Obviously, some cops are. Far from majority, but there's no doubt there's an ongoing training and supervision issue here. Then we have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. A super chat from Ashley for $2. She says, why they have to 5-on-1? Sounds like frat boy tax.
Yeah, it's definitely a glaring example example of bad training.
Yeah.
Bad training, insecure cops, on when they don't need to. As Tyre said during the assault, he's like, "You guys are doing a bit much, aren't you?" Understatement of fear, but it was an accurate, observation. These guys were just piling on him, and it was crazy. I'd be freaked out too. I'd want to run.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, he's only yards from his mom, and he's calling out for mom. I mean, this kid, he didn't have a record of violence. He didn't have a felony record. It was just a traffic stop. My God, he must have been terrified. And how horrific! Beaten to death. He dies a couple days later in a hospital. I mean, absolutely unjustifiable violence. Absolutely.
I certainly hope the department there. This is no compensation, but I certainly hope that family gets highly compensated for what happened to them. There's no replacing.
Right. Obviously, with death, there can be no real compensation, can there? But on the other hand, I hope they sue the crap, excuse my language, I hope they sue the crap out of the Memphis Police Department, the city of Memphis, and get a huge, huge settlement for that. Yeah. Clearly, there was a civil rights violation here. Clearly, there's a wrongful death case here. Now, what's interesting is, of course, that the majority of the cops in the Memphis Police Department are blacks. The police chief, the deputy police chief are black. The people hiring and training here were black. It doesn't eliminate racism, in my mind, conceptually from the problem, but the idea that somehow this is an emanation of, Trumpist white supremacy, now that's going over the top, it seems to me.
Nonsense. It's definitely indication that we have systemic issues with training, funding, and capturing the right types of people for this job who make our communities safer. And part of that is, way too many laws against people, attracting the wrong types of people, and then the news hyping contention between communities that just creates really, really hyper intense potentials that just need just a little touch for them to explode. And we got to take our foot off the gas, man. And we got to, I think, implement some of the things that we've talked about. I've heard some of the very same things across the news, but not much. I think we have a very unique voice with respect to this issue and pretty much every issue out there. James, I think we have to go. Daniel, do we have any more super chats?
We have 5 super chats more.
Okay, good.
Wow, what a great day for super chats this has been.
So thank you, Jonathan, for $5. He says, what do you make of Trump's vicious attacks on the police officer who shot rioter Ashley Babbitt?
Did you hear anything about that, James?
I think it is absolutely wrong for executive officers with our government, governors, mayors, presidents, to state an opinion on a criminal case that is pending. And I don't care. See, I can make this evaluation of the cops because I saw the video footage, and I'm no longer with the government. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not involved in this. But if I were involved in this, if I were a DA, if I were someone involved in the enforcement of this law, I would want to shut up. I think it's absolutely wrong. For example, when Barack Obama, there was that incident where that Harvard professor, you'll recall, was arrested. Yep. And he said, he came out criticizing, this is obviously horrible. No, it turned out to be perfectly justified. So I would really prefer it, wrong or right, if presidents of the United States would shut the F up about pending investigations and cases. They are taking a side. They're biasing. First of all, as a prosecutor, I don't like it because they're biasing my potential jury pool out there. But secondly, they're the guys enforcing the law. Say what you're going to say in court, enforce it in court, and don't try and shape opinion one way or another. Besides, you're the president. What you say will have an impact on this, and you are part of the government that's doing the enforcement. There were strict rules when I was a prosecutor about what I couldn't say about a crime to the media before, say, my murder case went to trial. I couldn't announce, for example, if there was a confession. I couldn't tell the press about this guy's, the cops could sometimes do this, they couldn't tell the press about his prior record, for example. Because we don't know what's going to come in as evidence and what's not. And if I start telling inadmissible evidence, I'm corrupting the jury pool. But even just a public officer with the government expressing an opinion, wrong or right, I think is a bad thing. And I would wish that our presidents, our governors, our mayors would not opine about pending criminal cases and investigations.
And I think
my rule.
I think that's right. I think as the president, you're the one elected office that is elected by the entire nation. That means you represent both tribes and all the people across the great United States of America. And the last two folks, Trump and Obama, opined for their political base. They say what they're saying because it's red meat for their political base, plain and simple. And so it's just a gross political move that has nothing to do with maintaining the stature of the presidency and the chief executor of the laws of the land. What else do we have, Daniel?
We have a super chat from Friday. Thank you for 100 Swedish krona. He says, is the abundance of firearms in the US a factor in police brutality? If the probability is high that the suspect is armed, a cop might be quicker to use force.
No, it's not. It's not a factor. In fact, you can watch. They have cop shows in some of the freest constitutional carry states in the Union. Alaska, for example, a cop will come up to your car and say, "Are you carrying a weapon?" "Yes, I am." And they just get it out in the open. It's not. It's actually where you have to be fearful is in the states that have the strictest gun control laws, because the people not abiding by the law, the people who have guns and the people not abiding by the law, and they're scary. They're the scary ones. But I don't see the prevalence of guns in America as causing a heightened police brutality. I think it's the culture, it's the bad training, it's a lot of things. The presence of a gun on them can certainly they always bring lethal force to any fight they're in, and if they're not confident about how to defend themselves with a firearm on their hip, that can often make them go to lethal force much sooner than they would if they were trained. James, are you aware of any stats that were studied?
I happen to be. As gun ownership and as the number of guns in America increased dramatically in the 1990s and the early 21st century, as violent crime and crime in general and gun crime in general was on a steep decline. So the per capita crime rate and the number of police incidents involving officer-involved shootings were all declining, and declining severely, even as the number of guns in America was increasing dramatically, even as per capita gun ownership was increasing dramatically. So I think currently people are also buying more guns as the crime rate in American cities goes up so disturbingly. But you don't want to use post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy as it's going up, because look at when the crime was going down. Look at when negative police incidents were going down while per capita gun ownership was going up. There is no relationship. And I happen to agree with Mark. I think that if there were fewer gun-free zones, for example, I think if we had armed officers at schools, there'd be fewer, at least they'd be responded to more quickly if there were security personnel with guns on school campuses. So quite the opposite. I think that the mere existence of a gun, just simply a store owner saying, we're protected by a gun in here, or someone in front of their home, we have a firearm, just the announcement to criminals that we have a gun in here decreases the number of crimes that occur. It doesn't increase them at all.
Yeah, not only that, I want to say concealed carry permit holders not only commit crimes exponentially less than the law, but much less even than police officers. So they're the most law-abiding citizens on the planet. Additionally, you get protection from the fact that the concealed carry guy is carrying a gun, because the criminal can see the armed security guy. That guy's a target, but he doesn't know how many other people are armed when there's a concealed carry in effect, or a constitutional carry in effect in that state. In fact, from what I understand, this comes from John Lott, who I think is one of the best scholars in this field, every single one of the districts in Texas that allows their teachers to conceal carry Every single one of them has been unaffected by a mass shooting. Not a single mass shooting in those districts. There's a reason for that. There's a reason these maniacs actually talk about in their manifestos going to gun-free zones, because their intention is to rack up casualties, to get famous, to get clickbait, to get points, to be seen before they either are taken out by cops or take themselves out. So definitely steep gun purchases have gone side by side with steep declines in crime, and we can't ignore that. We just simply can't ignore that.
Exactly correct. I endorse everything Mark said there. It's a simple fact. Yeah.
What else, Daniel?
A super chat from Catherine for $5. Thank you so much. She says, to Mark's point, maybe martial arts should be added to police academy training.
Yes.
Well, yes, it should. I know they do some forms of self-defense. They do they probably do UARA and arm bars and chokes. I don't know how extensive it is now. I know several police districts are embracing Renner Gracie's Jiu-Jitsu platform, and they are incorporating it and making it mandatory for their beat officers to practice Jiu-Jitsu on a regular basis. I think that's very inspiring, and that model should be picked up by every police force possible. Plus, martial arts, it teaches you a certain type of levelness, and it gives you a certain clarity. And I don't want to use the term humility in the wrong way. I don't like that term so much, but let's say self-perspective. That some cops, once they don the uniform, don't seem to have, but they will if they're in there in the dojo with people on a daily basis and getting their heads handed to them a little bit.
Right. Something. There's something too about martial arts training that does get you into your head about calming down, being perceptive, that your attitude is an important part of it, and that, I think, as much as anything, is what these new young cops need. Right. Look at sort of the pack mentality. And that's what it was. It was kind of a wolf pack mentality, this psychology that got into the minds of these cops that obviously had to take over at some point.
It's a very small man, insecure mentality that thinks I have to scream loud and hit you in the face hard to make you do what I want you to do. You don't have to at all. You just have to know what, and that will speak for itself.
But Mark's right. There's a big difference between the training recommended and required from district to district, from local law enforcement agency to local law enforcement agency. It's increasingly being embraced, I know, and I hope it is universally embraced. But there is still a lot of variation from different agency to different agency on the kind of training they get in self-defense, martial arts, jiu-jitsu.
Daniel, what else?
A super chat from Michael for $10. Thank you so much. He says, I know a lot of cops who are somewhat sociopathic with an inferiority complex.
Yeah, that's true.
Lots of cops as a DA. I knew lots and lots of cops. Hundreds and hundreds did I meet, and I worked with very closely, both street cops and detectives and FBI agents, all alike. And there is a wide variety. They're human beings just like the rest of us. In my experience, and it is anecdotal and my empirical experience, the vast majority are taking the job because they have a moral purpose, And most of them are principled people. Most of them are principled people. On the other hand, it is being given a gun and a billy club and power and the ability to use force. And so that also has the magnetic effect on people who are not psychologically so stable and people who are looking for a power trip for reasons of insecurity. So I think both can be true. I think that the large majority can be moral, principled people going into it for good reasons, and still you can have a regular segment that are always there of people who make it through. And that's why we need the psychological screening. That's why we need careful hiring practices. That's why we need really good training so we can ferret out these people. But yeah, the promise of a gun and a billy club, certain really bad psychologies are attracted to that as well. So it doesn't surprise me that you'd know a group of them. In my experience, I saw that myself. There were some cops who had a dangerous psychology. And, behind the scenes, I'm there whispering to their supervisor, maybe this person is better with a desk job, as Mark says, than being out on the field on Saturday nights. Yeah.
Well, and there's a book called The Sociopath Next Door that I think sort of levels the assertion, I think backed by stats, I don't quite remember, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% of the population verges into and is sociopathic in nature. Certainly in Hollywood, there's lots of those again. There's also lots of really good people. Hollywood also gets a bad rap that it doesn't deserve in a lot of ways. And people, they don't know Hollywood, just like they don't know cops. It's a different culture for them. So they sort of impose their own notions of what the people are all about. And certainly those folks, especially when we're lowering the qualifications, when we're upping their power, their capacity to control other people by making lots of things illegal that shouldn't be illegal, you're going to attract a certain element over others. That's for sure. And changing some of those exterior elements will, I think, weed out the bad apples, and making them train the way they have to show restraint and to be community minded will also, I think, weed out the bad apples, or at least, put them where they, in the bushel they need to be in. Any other
A last super chat from Free Trade for 50 Swedish krona. Thank you so much. He says, in your estimation, what percentage of police work is a consequence of the criminalization of drugs?
Half the people that are incarcerated in American jails and prisons today are there because of the drug laws. Does that answer your question? Tomorrow, if we legalize drugs, decriminalize drugs, we could effectively double our police force without spending a dime. It's that simple. Wow. Nearly every single one of the, I did for a long time in the DA's office, I would do appellate work and search and seizure motions. And I can tell you that the vast majority, something like 80%, 90% of the dubious searches, the question searches, come from drug laws. And so we have to bend the rules about search and seizure. Why? Because we have to enforce drug laws. No, we don't. The point is those bends happen because of the drug laws. When you make the possession of something, the mere possession of something, a crime, right? Consider that half the people incarcerated today are incarcerated because of some kind of drug law.
Yeah, and also the what do they call the phenomenon when the cops can break into your house, sort of lay siege to your house and arrest you?
No-knock warrants.
No-knock warrants, whatever those were, they were. I mean, before the drug laws started really taking effect, that was an extremely limited phenomenon, which has just shot through the roof exponentially. The idea that the police can bust into your house in the middle of the night, drag you out of bed, and lock you up, and or shoot your dog, and or possibly kill your wife because she thinks you're being invaded by, a home invasion robber,
right.
All because you're in possession of a substance that they've arbitrarily decided is illegal, is a travesty of justice. It is a fascistic in the extreme, and it
totally agree. How many times was I on search warrant duty, or you've got the phone 24/7 and you've got the judge who's on call, and the detective calls you up and says, hey, I want a search warrant. And you cover with him the evidence to see if we have enough evidence to bother the judge at 2 a.m. to try and get a night warrant. But to get night service or to get no-knock permission, that's a very rare thing. And you have to have special justification for the cop to say, well, because the judge will say, well, why can't you do this tomorrow morning during daylight business hours? Or why do you have to avoid the police demanding entry notice before you start breaking in a door and give people some fair notice? Those things do have a dramatic impact on what goes down during the execution of that warrant. People, like you say, Mark, are much more likely at 2 a.m. What the heck is going on? And are these criminals? What's going on? And you're also absolutely right that, again, this is disproportionately involving drug cases. The reason why we can't have a no-knock warrant, Mr. Valliant, I am told, is because they will destroy the drug evidence. Oh, okay. So that's your problem. You're not worried so much about physical evidence about a violent crime. That probably won't disappear so much. But if it is, okay, there should be a mechanism for, I think, no-knock warrants. I think there should be a mechanism for nighttime service, but those are comparatively few in other cases. Drug cases are a lot of the time, if not, it's hard for me, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I want to say most of those cases are generated by drug cases where they're just breaking into homes. Another thing, asset forfeiture laws. My God, how unfair and awful those things are. And again, it motivates the cops to say, yeah, we want to surprise them and catch those drugs in the house. So give us nighttime service and no-knock authority. It's a very dangerous thing to give cops.
Yep, certainly is. Daniel, what else you got?
Those are all the super chats.
Well, I want to thank everyone for the super chats. We've been having really a stellar time in recent days with super chats. We really have, and I want to thank all of you for doing that. We've got some great stuff coming up later this week. Tomorrow, I think, for the collective, we'll have an episode called "It's a Wonderful Life, Ayn Rand," something like that.
It's a wonderful rant.
It's a wonderful rant. So what would life be like? What would the world be like? What would reality look like if we just removed Ayn Rand from history? What a fascinating discussion that'll be for the collective tomorrow. This Sunday, for paid subscribers of Ayn Rand Center UK, we will be starting a whole new Leonard Peikoff course for those who are involved in the Sunday seminars. Objectivism, the state of the art. And we've got a bunch of new people who are going to be there. You can actually participate in a discussion in that. So do consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. You get all kinds of perks, and that's one of them. So I want to thank you for joining us today, and it's always a pleasure to be with you, Mark. I have to say, let's do this again and soon.
Let's do it, James. Great to see you guys, and we'll catch you on the other side. Peace.
Peace.